May the peace of Christ be with you all. My name is Maria, and today I want to share with you a testimony that completely transformed my life and the life of my family. I know that many of you are going through difficulties and may be seeking an answer from God. I am here to tell you that He hears. He sees every tear, every prayer. He is faithful to perform the impossible. My story begins with my daughter, Sophia, a joyful, lively girl, only 8 years old. Sophia was always the sunshine in our home. Her smile brightened our days. My husband, João, and I lived a simple life, but we were a united family, full of love and gratitude to God for everything. We never imagined that suddenly such a fierce storm would fall upon us. It all started with small signs. Sophia, always so full of energy, began to complain of fatigue. At first, it didn't seem like much. I thought it was just a cold. But as the days went by, she grew weaker. Her fever wouldn't go down, and each morning she seemed to lose more strength. Something in my heart told me this wasn't just a common fever. So, João and I decided to take her to the hospital, not yet knowing what awaited us. They ran tests, and the doctor asked us to come back the next day for the results. That night, I couldn't sleep. I woke up several times, looking at Sophia lying in her bed. She seemed so peaceful, but my heart was heavy. I sensed that something was wrong. The next day, when we entered the doctor's office, I could tell from his expression that the news wasn't going to be good. He took a deep breath and said to us, "Sophia has leukemia." In that instant, my world stopped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My heart tightened in a way that's impossible to describe. Leukemia. Blood cancer. My little girl, so young, so full of life, had a serious disease that threatened to take her from us. I looked at Sophia, and she, not understanding the gravity of the situation, was still smiling. At that moment, a part of me broke. As a mother, I wanted to protect her from everything, to take that disease away from her and carry it myself. But I couldn't. I was overcome by silent despair. While the doctor explained the treatment, the risks, and the low chances of recovery, I could barely hear him. My mind was in shock, and my heart was crying out, "God, don't let this happen. Save my daughter." The drive home was the hardest. Sophia was quiet in the back seat, and I held back tears so she wouldn't see me cry. When we got home, she went straight to her room to rest, and João and I sat in the living room, speechless. The silence was heavy. I wanted to scream, to understand why this was happening. I couldn't stop thinking about the possibility of losing my daughter. The following weeks were like a nightmare. Sophia began chemotherapy, and I watched as my daughter, so full of life, was overtaken by weakness. She lost her hair, her strength, and the sparkle in her eyes. Every time she said, "Mom, it hurts," my heart broke a little more. I cried in silence, alone in my room, so she wouldn't see my despair. I knew I needed to be strong for her, but inside I felt destroyed. It was in that moment of greatest pain and despair that I turned completely to God. There was nothing else I could do as a mother, except cry out for a miracle. Every night I knelt by Sophia's bed, holding her hand while she slept, and I prayed with all my soul. "Lord, you are the God of miracles. Don't abandon us now. Heal my daughter. I know you can." These prayers were the only thing that kept me going. I knew that even when everything seemed lost, God was still with us. And so, we began our journey. A journey of pain, but also of faith and hope. At that moment, I didn't know what the future held, but I clung to the certainty that God had a purpose, even in the midst of that storm. When I heard the diagnosis of leukemia, I felt as if my heart had been ripped out of my chest. It was a pain unlike anything I had ever felt before. The doctor tried to be gentle with his words, explaining the technical details, but all I could think was, "My daughter has cancer. My daughter could die." Those words echoed in my mind, and the world around me seemed to crumble. I remember looking at Sophia in that moment. She was playing with her fingers, unaware of the gravity of what was happening. Her innocent eyes still sparkled, and as a mother, I felt an indescribable pain thinking about what she would have to face. How am I going to explain this to her? I wondered. How do you tell an 8-year-old child that her life is hanging by a thread? That the carefree days of playing would now be replaced by hospitals, needles, and painful treatments? The doctor continued to talk about the treatment plan. Sophia's leukemia was aggressive. She would need to undergo several rounds of chemotherapy, and the side effects would be devastating. He was honest, maybe even too much so. The chances of a cure were uncertain, and we had to prepare for the worst. But how does a mother prepare to lose her child? There's no way to prepare for something like that. We left the doctor's office in silence. Sophia, not understanding what was happening, asked if she could have ice cream. My heart broke again. I looked at her and, forcing a smile, replied, "Of course, honey. Let's go get some ice cream." João beside me gripped the steering wheel tightly as we drove home. I knew he was trying to be strong, but his eyes were full of tears. It was hard for him, too, but João had always been more reserved with his emotions. He kept his feelings inside, while I was falling apart on the inside. When we got home, I tried to act normal. I made dinner, helped Sophia with her bath, and lay down beside her as she fell asleep. She still didn't know what was coming. For her, that day was just another ordinary day. But for me, it was the first day of a battle I never thought we would have to fight. After she fell asleep, I went to my room, and there, alone, I cried. I cried like I had never cried before. I remember falling to my knees by the side of the bed, burying my face in my hands and begging God, "Please, Lord, don't let me lose my daughter. I know you are greater than any disease. I don't know what to do, but I trust that you have the power to heal her." Each passing day only seemed to bring more bad news. Sophia began her chemotherapy sessions. The first few rounds were terrible, and watching my daughter suffer like that broke my heart even more. Her hair began to fall out, and Sophia, who had once been full of life, now barely had the strength to get out of bed. The pain consumed her body, and she would cry softly at night, trying not to wake me. But I heard every sigh, every groan of pain, and it tore me apart inside. I remember one night in particular. I was sitting by her bed, holding her small hand as she slept. I looked at her face, so pale, so tired. In that moment, I felt completely helpless. As a mother, you want to protect your child from all harm, but there was nothing I could do except be there. The only comfort I had was in prayer. And that night, with tears streaming down my face, I prayed like I had never prayed before. I cried out to God with all my heart. "Lord, please heal my daughter. I know you can do the impossible. Don't let her suffer anymore. Perform a miracle." Days went by, and with each new visit to the hospital, the doctors were cautious in giving us hope. The treatment didn't seem to be working as we had hoped. Sophia had more days of weakness than of improvement, and this left us completely broken. João and I tried to be strong for her, but sometimes, in the quiet of our home, we would hold each other and cry together. We knew there was nothing more we could do except trust in God. And it was in this phase, where everything seemed to be falling apart, that our faith was truly tested. I knew that only a miracle could change Sophia's fate. Each hospital visit, each test, each word from the doctors left us more anxious, but something inside me, even if small, refused to give up. God was our only hope. From that moment on, our lives became a routine of hospitals, tests, and treatments. Sophia's smile, which had once been constant, now appeared rarely. Chemotherapy was brutal. Each session seemed to drain more and more of her strength. I held her tight while she vomited and cried from the pain. Watching her like that shattered my heart into 1,000 pieces. I kept wondering how God could allow such a small child to endure so much suffering. Soon after the treatment began, Sophia's hair started to fall out. I remember one morning when she woke up and quietly called me, "Mom, my pillow is full of hair." When I looked, my chest tightened with pain. I knew this would happen, but nothing prepared me for the sadness on her face at that moment. Trying to stay calm, I smiled and said, "It's okay, honey. Your hair will grow back when you're better. And until then, we can wear those colorful scarves you love." She smiled a little, but I knew it wasn't the same smile as before. That illness was taking more than just her health. It was stealing her joy. What hurt even more was that, despite all the treatment, Sophia wasn't getting better. Every time we went back to the doctor for an appointment, the test results didn't show the progress we had hoped for. The leukemia was resisting, and the doctors began talking about the possibility of more aggressive treatments with even greater risks. With every new piece of bad news, it felt like the ground was opening up beneath my feet.
It was at this point that I realized medicine alone wouldn't be enough. I'm not saying the doctors weren't doing their best. I know they were. But as a mother, deep in my heart, I knew that only God could do the impossible. So, Joelle and I began to seek the Lord in a way we had never done before. Every night, while Sophia slept, we knelt together by her bed and prayed. We cried out to God, pouring our hearts out before Him. I remember one night in particular. We were in Sophia's room, and she had had a very difficult day. She was too weak to talk, her eyes barely able to stay open, but I knew she was in pain. When she finally fell asleep, Joelle and I knelt beside her. That night's prayer was different. It wasn't just a plea. It was a cry from the depths of our souls. I wept before God like never before. Lord, you are the only one who can save her. Please perform a miracle. I trust in you. I know you are powerful. Touch my daughter, Lord. Don't let her suffer any longer. In that moment, I felt an indescribable peace in my heart. It was as if God was there, in that room, with His hands over Sophia. Joelle and I hugged in silence, feeling the presence of God so real, so palpable. Even in the midst of all the pain, a small flame of hope began to ignite within me. Our friends and family also began to unite in prayer. Brothers and sisters from the church came to our house to pray with us. Sometimes we held prayer vigils, crying out together for Sophia's healing. The phone rang constantly, with people telling us they were praying and fasting for her. That support network was what sustained us. The faith of others strengthened us, and in some way it made us believe that God was listening, even though the miracle had not yet manifested. Amid all the suffering, I began to realize that God was teaching us something. He was teaching us to depend on Him completely. There were many moments when I wanted to give up, to surrender to despair, but there was always a small voice in my heart saying, "Trust, I am in control." Even when the doctors spoke of new treatments, new complications, my faith refused to crumble. With every difficult piece of news, I chose to trust God even more. I knew that if I gave in to fear, there would be nothing left inside me. So I decided to believe, even without seeing. I decided to keep believing in the miracle, even when it seemed like hope was slipping away. It was a daily battle. Sophia, so fragile, would often look at me and ask, "Mommy, I'm going to get better, right?" And despite all the fear and pain I felt, I would smile and say, "Yes, my love. God is taking care of you. He will heal you." Every time I spoke those words, I felt my faith growing stronger. I believed in what I was saying, and God, in His goodness, gave me the strength to carry on. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Each new chemotherapy session was a battle, but I knew that despite everything, God was in control. Sophia was a warrior. Even on the hardest days, she found the strength to smile, to play with her dolls, to hold my hand and say, "I love you, Mommy." And that, more than anything else, was what kept me going. With every prayer, every tear, I felt we were getting closer to the miracle. I didn't know how or when, but I believed with all my heart that God was going to do something extraordinary. Our faith was tested, but I knew He would never abandon us. And it was in that place of complete dependence and trust in God that the unexpected began to happen. The miracle was on its way. It was in the midst of that exhausting routine of hospitals and treatments that something began to change. At first, it was hard to believe it was real. Everything started so subtly, almost imperceptibly, that even the doctors didn't realize it at first. Sophia was in the middle of yet another round of tests when the doctor entered the room with a puzzled look on his face. He looked at the papers, then at us, and finally said, "Something strange is happening here. Sophia's test results are changing." My heart started pounding. Joao and I exchanged glances, unsure of what that meant. Could we finally be seeing some progress? The doctor explained that the levels of cancerous cells in her blood were decreasing, something he didn't expect at that stage of the treatment. "It's still too early to celebrate," he said, but I could tell he was surprised. Even with all the intensive treatments, he couldn't explain what was happening. It was at that moment that I felt a spark of hope reignite within me. The prayers, the tears, the cries before God, all of it was reaching heaven. I was certain that God was beginning to move. As the days passed, Sophia began to show clearer signs of improvement. The body that had been so frail and weak started to respond. Her appetite, which had been lost for so long, gradually returned. She started being able to sit up in bed on her own, and one particularly emotional day, she asked to get up and walk around the hospital room. It was something she hadn't been able to do for weeks. The doctors were astonished, but as her mother, I knew exactly what was happening. God was touching Sophia with his healing hands. Each day brought a new victory. The fever that had plagued her constantly disappeared. The pains that had made her cry at night became increasingly rare. Sophia was smiling again, a smile I had feared I would never see again. The doctors, perplexed, continued running tests. With each appointment, the results were more and more encouraging. What once seemed like a grim prognosis started turning into something none of us had expected. The tests showed that the cancer was retreating. I will never forget the day the doctor came into the room with the latest report in his hands. He sat down in front of us, visibly emotional. He looked into my eyes and said, "I don't know how to explain this, but there are no more signs of leukemia in Sophia's blood. The tests are completely clean." Those words echoed in my mind. I didn't know whether to cry, laugh, or fall to my knees right then and there to thank God. João, sitting beside me, was silent, tears streaming down his face. Sophia looked at us, still not fully understanding, and asked, "Mommy, am I healed?" And with my voice choked with emotion, I replied, "Yes, my love, you are healed." It was the most incredible moment of my life. I knew the doctors couldn't explain it, but for me, the explanation was clear. God had performed the miracle we had been praying for. At that moment, I felt a peace and gratitude so deep that words can't describe it. I knew with absolute certainty that God had heard every one of our prayers. He had answered in a way that only He could. The doctors continued to monitor Sophia in the following weeks, still shocked by what they were seeing. All the signs of leukemia had disappeared. They ran additional tests, repeated every exam, and the result was always the same. The leukemia was completely gone. Meanwhile, Sophia's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. In no time, she was back to her old energetic self, running through the hospital halls, smiling and playing like she used to. Her hair, which had fallen out due to the chemotherapy, began to grow back. It was as if God wasn't just healing her body, but also restoring her joy, her life, her essence. The doctors, despite being unable to explain what had happened, told us she was in complete remission. But for me, this wasn't just remission. It was divine healing. God had done the impossible. Where the doctors saw uncertainty, I saw the miracle that only God's hand could perform. My daughter, who just weeks before had been on the brink of death, was now standing, full of life and health. And it was all because of God's grace and power. I never doubted that He was capable, but seeing the miracle unfold before my eyes was something that changed me forever. We left the hospital with Sophia completely healed. And as we walked out of that place that had been the scene of so many tears and prayers, all I could think about was how wonderful and faithful God is. He hadn't just restored Sophia's health, He had also renewed our faith and our hope. This was the unexpected miracle, the moment when the impossible happened, and God showed us that, even in the darkest circumstances, He is still the God who heals, who restores, and who makes the impossible possible. After we left the hospital with Sophia's healing confirmed, our lives were never the same again. Not only because our daughter was healthy again, but because something much greater had changed within us. The experience of seeing God's power at work so directly transformed the way we lived and how we viewed our faith. I remember the first time we returned to church after Sophia's recovery. As soon as we walked in, we could feel the eyes of the congregation, filled with surprise, but also with joy and renewed faith. Everyone there knew how much we had prayed, how much we had cried out for a miracle. And now, there we were, with Sophia by our side, smiling and full of life. It was impossible to hold back the tears as we shared before the congregation what God had done. Every word was filled with gratitude and reverence. During that service, the pastor called us to the front, and when he asked us to share the testimony of her healing, I realized just how kind God had been to us. I looked at Sophia, her eyes sparkling, and I began to speak. Every detail of that painful journey took on a new meaning. I knew that even in the darkest moments, God had always been there, sustaining each of us, preparing us for that moment of victory. I spoke about the devastating diagnosis, the suffering of seeing my daughter so fragile, and especially about how God transformed our hearts while we prayed for that miracle. But the most important thing was what God had taught us along this journey. Our faith was tested and refined like gold in the fire. God didn't just heal Sophia's disease, He completely transformed us. The faith of our family, which had already been strong, became unshakable. We learned to trust in God in a way we had never experienced before. During the treatment, when everything seemed hopeless, we learned the true meaning of depending entirely on the Lord. And when the miracle came, we realized that God not only answers, but He does far more than we could ever ask or imagine. Sophia, despite being so young, was also deeply impacted by this experience. Sometimes, I still get emotional hearing her tell her story to the other children at church. She speaks simply, but with a conviction that comes from her heart. Jesus healed me. Watching this faith grow inside her is something words cannot describe. I know God has a special purpose for Sophia's life, and she carries in her heart the certainty that He is real, loving, and powerful. Our family, which had always lived a life devoted to God, now seeks Him even more. We pray more, we are more involved in church, and most importantly, we share this story of faith and miracle with everyone around us. Because when God does something this incredible in your life, you cannot keep it to yourself. Now, when I look back, I can see how every moment of pain and despair was part of God's plan to strengthen and draw us closer to Him. I know that during the long nights of suffering, it felt like the victory would never come, but God was always at work, even when we couldn't see it. I've learned that in our weakness, He is strong, and when we come to the end of ourselves, that's when His power is revealed in the most glorious way. Today, when I see Sophia running through the garden, smiling as she used to, my heart overflows with gratitude. Every time I look at her, I am reminded that God is the God of miracles, the God who never abandons us, even in the hardest moments. Every laugh, every hug, every little gesture of hers reminds me of how great God's love is. The impact of this miracle on our lives has been so profound that it has even changed the way we relate to other people. Whenever we meet someone going through a difficult time, I share our story. It doesn't matter what storm the person is facing, whether it's an illness, a financial struggle, or a family problem. I say with all conviction that there is a God who is greater than any problem, and He is with all those who trust in Him. I don't know what you, who are hearing this testimony, are going through right now. Maybe you are fighting a battle that seems impossible to win, but I am here to tell you that nothing is impossible for God. It doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. It doesn't matter how big the difficulty is. God is powerful enough to perform the miracle you need. He did it in my daughter Sophia's life, and He can do it in your life too. Trust in Him, seek His presence, And above all, don't give up. The pain may be great, but the victory will be even greater. The Lord is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He continues to be the God of miracles, and I am a living witness of this. Sophia is here with me, full of life and joy, because our God heard our prayers. May this story renew your faith, strengthen your hope, and remind you that God still performs miracles, all for His glory. If you were touched by this testimony, I want to encourage you not to lose hope. God is with you, even in the most difficult moments. If you are going through a struggle, leave your prayer request in the comments below. Myself and many brothers and sisters in Christ will be praying for you, believing that God can work in your life. Until the next video. And if this testimony brought faith and encouragement to your heart, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message of hope. Many people are waiting for a word of comfort, and you can be God's instrument to bring this message to them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell to receive more powerful testimonies like this one, which will strengthen your faith. May God bless you and continue performing miracles in your life. The peace of the Lord.